right, hello everyone, and welcome to the second webinar for Maritimes MarshWatch. If you haven't seen the first webinar, we recommend going back and watching that one first because it gives you lots of helpful information and context for the program. So if you have already seen the first webinar, let's jump right into some bird identification tips and tricks. So for any object, there are 4 keys to identifying it, and this applies to birds as well. And we do this subconsciously every single day. So for example, I haven't seen every single coffee mug that exists in the world, but based on looking at these 4 keys, the shape, size, context, and coloration, I can tell what it is. So let's try out an example. So see how long it takes you to figure out what I'm describing. So the object is bigger than an apple, but smaller than a car tire. It's found at certain sporting events, high school gyms, maybe it's in your garage. It's often thrown and carried. It's rounded with 2 pointier ends, and it is brown with white stitch marks on one side. So at the beginning, when I just started by describing the size, there were so many things that object could be, right? But as I added details about the context that you found it in, what the shape was, what the color was, you probably quickly figured out that I was talking about the football. And we can use the same principle with birds, but we have an added bonus of sound as an ID feature as well. So the first ID feature that we look at with birds is their size. And it's usually quite helpful to compare the bird that you're looking at to a bird that you already know. So the website All About Birds from the Cornell Lab of Ornithology provides this really useful scale using 4 quite common birds that even if you're not a birder, you probably recognize them. So sparrow, robin, crow, and goose. And the size of a bird can be helpful for getting a general sense of what type of bird it could be. For example, if it's really tiny, it could be a songbird. If it's quite large, it could be a bird of prey. The second thing to look at is the shape of the bird. And there are a few components that you want to focus on. So the first is the bill, of course. So is it long or short, heavy or thin? Does it curve up, curve down, or is it straight? And bill shape is really helpful because it can indicate the diet of the bird, and that can guide you towards what kind of bird it is. For example, if we look at the bird silhouette on the right here, we can see it has a long, thick, and pointy bill, which kind of looks like a spear. So you can think this bird probably is carnivorous. Maybe it spears like little frogs, fish, or maybe rodents. So that's a good starting point. You can also look at the legs, so whether they are long or short, and that can indicate what type of habitat the bird uses. So again, if we focus on that bird on the right, it has fairly long legs, which is usually characteristic of birds that like to, for example, walk around in shallow water or maybe in fields. And that can guide you again towards categories of birds like, for example, shorebirds or herons or cranes. You can also look at the neck, so whether it is long or short, thick or thin. And again, that's another helpful feature for getting more specific about the group of birds. So the bird on the right, it has quite a long and thin neck. So birds with those kinds of necks include geese, swans, and herons. And then you can also look at the body shape. So is the body shape thick or thin or slender? And when you combine all of these characteristics, the bill, the legs, the neck, the body shape, that can give you a pretty good sense of what kind of bird it is. So again, if we think about the bird on the right with its long, thick, pointy bill, a long, thin neck, long legs, and a body that is not super thick, not super thin, kind of medium, These characteristics indicate that it's probably a bird that spends a lot of time in shallow water. It's probably a carnivore. Maybe it's using that long neck to dart out like a spear and stab its prey. So these are indicators of some kind of heron. One thing to be careful about when looking at the shape of a bird is that they can change their posture and their feather position, and this can change their silhouette. So if we look at our great blue heron, for example, it has that neck stretched out, very thin, but it can also tuck its neck down, and that creates a much more compact body shape that's quite different from the first. The robin, it can have its feathers down against its body, or it can fluff them up, becoming much more round in shape. And then the blue jay has that characteristic crest, but it can flatten it down. So shape is a great identifying feature, but we have to be aware that it can be variable depending on the situation. The third key that you can look at for identifying birds is their context. So what is the bird doing and where is it living? A good example is looking at different types of duck. So we have dabblers, which tip up when they're feeding, so they stick their butts in the air, or they feed on the surface. They're good at walking on land, and they can fly from a standstill. And then divers, as the name suggests, they dive below the surface. They're pretty poor at walking on land, and they need a runway to take off. So again, if you're not quite sure what kind of a duck you're looking at, you can first characterize it as a dabbler or a diver based on its behavior, and then you can narrow down from there using the other ID tricks. And then coloration is, of course, a great ID key for identifying birds. In ducks, it's particularly useful to look at the wing patterns. So especially when they're in flight, ducks have a patch of color on the back or trailing edge of the wing, which is called a speculum. And this speculum is different colors in different species. So, for example, the mallard has a blue speculum, and the blue-winged teal has a more greenish speculum, but also that blue-winged teal has an additional forewing patch, which the mallard does not have. So different species have different combinations of color patterns on the wings. Color in ducks is a little bit tricky because there is seasonal variation. So after the breeding season in the late summer or early fall, they go into a molt where they lose their breeding plumage and they become temporarily flightless. In their non-breeding plumage, or what is known as eclipse plumage, they are a lot harder to identify. So you can see that the male mallard becomes much more drab and less striking in its eclipse plumage. And then, of course, we have this bonus with birds, which is that they are very vocal species, and their sounds can be really great identifying features. So why do birds sing? Well, one of the main reasons in the breeding season is to attract a mate. So many of the sounds that we will show you in the MarshWatch webinars are courtship songs. Another reason that they sing is to defend their territory against rivals. And by doing this, they make sure that the resources in their territory are monopolized for themselves or their young. And finally, they also sometimes make sounds to sound the alarm about threat. So unfortunately, often when you are looking at birds, the threat is you. So you will often hear them making these alarm calls, and this can be to warn their mates or their offspring about the presence of the threat, or sometimes it's to try to scare away the threat. And sound is, of course, a great ID tool, and this is especially true because a lot of times with birds, you will not see them because they'll be hidden in vegetation, for example, but you will hear them. So being able to identify the vocalizations will allow you to identify a wider variety of the birds that are in a habitat. So now that we have a good basis for how to identify birds, let's get started with our first set of species. Today, we will be focusing on waterfowl, shorebirds, and grebes. And these are the 7 species that we will look at. And we will also take a look at 2 amphibians, the wood frog and the spring keeper. And we're going to start off easy with a species that many of you, I'm sure, recognize, which is the Canada goose. This is a large goose. The sexes are very similar in appearance, so they both have a black head and neck, a white chin strap, a brown body, and a white rear. And their habitat is pretty varied. They can be found in wetlands, lakes, rivers, and urban settings near water. Basically, any area that has open water and opportunity for grazing. And their vocalizations are pretty characteristic goose-like honking. So let's take a listen to that. And when they get agitated, they can get very, very nosy and vocal, which you will hear in this recording. So again, you're probably familiar with those noises. Their diet, they are a grazer, so they feed on grasses, sedges, and other plants. And in the fall and winter, they also eat berries and seeds and agricultural grains. And very often you'll see Canada geese, for example, in parks because they forage on our lawns. Their distribution is pretty broad in North America. So in the Maritimes, this is mostly their breeding range, so you will see them forming that V-shaped migration pattern and honking overhead as they travel south in the fall and north in the spring. Now, another familiar species that you will probably encounter in a marsh survey or in a wetland survey is the mallard. So this is a large dabbling duck. Unlike the Canada goose, there are sex differences. So the drake, the male, has an iridescent green head, a thin white collar, a yellow bill, a brown breast, curly tail feathers, and gray flanks. So it's fairly elaborate in terms of its color pattern. And the speculum is blue bordered with black and white in both sexes. And you can find them in pretty much any wetland habitat. In terms of their vocalization, they make a very characteristic quacking. So let's take a listen to that. So when you think of a duck, you probably think of that noise. That quack is a mallard. The hen is much less elaborate in coloration than the drake. So she's a mottled brown with an orange bill with a dark center. Remember, the male, the drake, has a yellow bill. And the hen has a fine dark line through the eye. And like the drake, the hen has a blue speculum bordered with black and white. Mallards are surface feeders or dabblers, so they are omnivorous generalists. They eat a wide variety of aquatic invertebrates, seeds of wetland plants, aquatic vegetation, and also agricultural crops. And one interesting fact about mallards is that they are one of 2 ancestors of domestic ducks, which is why their body shape looks quite similar to domestic ducks, although domestic ducks have been bred to have a variety of color patterns that are different. And mallards are, again, very widely distributed across North America. And in the southern part of the Maritimes, they are resident, so they're present year-round. In northern New Brunswick, they are only present during the breeding season. Now, a species that is quite similar to the mallard in many ways is the American black duck. So again, it's a large dabbling duck. The drake is characterized by a dark brown body contrasting with a pale brown head. So there's a very clear dividing line between the head color and the body color. The male has a yellow bill and a purple-blue speculum with a black edge. Recall that the mallard has black and white. And the American black duck sounds quite similar to the mallard. So the quack is maybe slightly deeper in the American black duck, but really quite similar to the mallard. The hen, like the male, she has a dark brown body that contrasts with a pale brown head. She has a purple-blue speculum lined with black. But unlike the male, her bill is olive-colored as opposed to that bright yellow. And the habitat of the American black duck is mostly freshwater wetlands during the breeding season and salt marshes during the winter. They are generalist dabblers like the mallard, so they eat aquatic plant matter and invertebrates, fish and amphibians, berries and seeds, and zooplankton. And unlike the mallard, the American black duck is only found in eastern North America. But like the mallard, their breeding range is kind of in the northern part, and then they are resident more in the southern part of the Maritimes. And mallards and American black ducks are quite similar in appearance, so let's walk through some key differences for distinguishing them. So in particular, it's difficult to distinguish the female mallard from the American black duck. Recall that the female mallard has an orange and black bill. The American black duck male has a yellow bill. And the female mallard has a speculum lined with white and black, whereas the American black duck male has a speculum that is only lined with black. And of course, it's not listed on the slide here, but the American black duck male has a darker brown body. And similarly, when we're looking at the mallard female and the American black duck female, focus on the bill color, so orange and black for the mallard and olive colored for the female American black duck. And again, that speculum has that white and black in the mallard, but only black in the American black duck. These species are quite similar, so it usually takes a little bit of practice to distinguish them. Now, one very distinctive duck that you will encounter in your surveys is the ringneck duck. And so unlike the mallard and American black duck, this is a diving duck, and they have a characteristic peaked, almost triangular shaped head and a dark bill with a white ring. The drake has a black back, head, breast, and rear, and then these lighter gray flanks with a white spur, so there's kind of a pointy bit sticking up near the front, near the breast. That can look very pale in certain light. The ring neck refers to a purple ring on the neck, but this is actually rarely seen, so it's more accurate to call the ringneck duck the ring-billed duck because that white ring on the bill is much more distinctive. And the eye of the drake is bright yellow or orange. You can find ringneck ducks mostly in shallow wetlands, fens, and bogs. And in terms of their wings, they don't really have a speculum, but they do have this line of gray on the bottom edge of the wing that is, again, a good identifying feature. And the female, she also has a dark bill with a white ring. She is reddish brown overall with a slightly darker back. So again, she's more drab than the male. She has a white eye ring, kind of looks like she's wearing spectacles. The base of the bill is pale, and then she has a dark brown eye, whereas again, the male has that orange or yellow eye. Like the male, the female has that line of gray feathers along the bottom edge of the wing. And in terms of their diet, they are opportunistic generalists like mallards and American black ducks. They are generally referred to as diving ducks, but they do engage in some dabbling behavior. So they eat seeds, tubers, and plant matter, but also insects, leeches, snails, and plants. And their vocalization is definitely different from the mallard or the American black duck. So it's a little bit hoarser and deeper than either the American black duck or the mallard. And their distribution is again pretty broad, but in the Maritimes region, they are migratory, so they are only present during the breeding season. So now let's change gears and talk about one of the target species for the marsh monitoring program, which is the willet. This is a large shorebird with a dark straight bill and long dull gray legs. And it's useful to focus on the color of the legs with shorebirds because they can look quite similar in coloration, but they often differ in leg color. For example, the greater yellow legs is similar in color to the willet, but it has these bright yellow legs. Both sexes of the willet are a mottled gray overall with pale eye ring, and then they have wing flashes in bold black and white. And their habitat is the edges of wetlands and ponds, and they nest in upland habitat, so slightly away from the water. And willets are extremely vocal when they are alarmed. So they make two vocalizations. The first is kind of a single cleep note that is repeated. Which again, you will hear when they are alarmed. And then the second call is what gives them their name. It's often described as willet willet. And it's more, not so much their alarm call, but their courtship call. Their diet is mostly insects, crustaceans, mollusks, and small fish and amphibians and other little invertebrates. And they essentially will walk through shallow water and swish their bill around and probe in the mud for food. So the willet has a much more restricted distribution than the other species that we've seen so far. And so in the Maritimes, you will find them mostly in southern New Brunswick, PEI, and Nova Scotia during the breeding season. Another shorebird that you're likely to encounter in your marsh monitoring surveys is the Wilson snipe. So this is a medium-sized shorebird. It has a really distinctive, very long and straight bill, a large head on a short neck, and a pretty chunky, plump body shape. Both sexes are a mottled brown with pale buff stripes down the back. and a striped head. And you can find Wilson snipe in shallow wetlands and damp soil habitats because of their diet, which is they probe in wet soil, mud, and shallow water, looking for larval insects and earthworms, crustaceans, and mollusks. And they make very characteristic vocalizations. So males will give a winnowing flight display, which you can hear here. And it's a very eerie sounding call. And then they also make a regular keck, 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 which sounds a little bit like a squeaky wheel at regular intervals. And that's more their conventional call to communicate with each other. They're very widely distributed across North America, and they are migratory in the Maritimes, so only present during the breeding season. And finally, the last species we're going to look at is the pied-billed grebe. So this is a small, compact grebe with a blocky head shape, and both sexes are a gray-brown overall. Possibly their most distinctive feature is the pied bill, which is this pale whitish color with a black ring. And then there is a white eye ring as well, and a black chin. Pied-billed grebes are fairly secretive, and they often do something called submarining when they are disturbed, where they will submerge their part of their body under the water while keeping their eyes and their head above the water, as you can see in the bottom image here. And they are found in wetlands with emerging vegetation and open water deep enough for diving for their food. And they eat a pretty wide variety of food that they can find when they are diving down. So fish, crustaceans, insect larvae, and adult insects, leeches, and amphibians. And they have a very distinctive courtship call that they will make that sounds a little bit like a monkey, which you can hear in this recording. And then they also make this second call, which I think sounds a little bit like the laughing of a hyena. And although these grebes are very secretive, they are pretty vocal, so you can often identify them by their sounds, and they're also quite territorial. So that is usually one of the reasons that they are vocalizing. One interesting fact about pied-billed grebes is that they have a very complicated courtship ritual that has a series of essentially dance steps that they go through, and at the end they will start building their nest. And so they form these really strong pair bonds. And they are distributed, again, across North America, like many of the species we've seen today. And they breed in the southern parts of the Maritimes, not so much in over New Brunswick. And finally, let's switch gears and talk about the two amphibians for today. So one species that you are likely to hear in any kind of wetland is the wood frog. So it is a medium-sized frog, 5 to 7 centimeters long. And the most distinctive visual feature is the dark patch behind the eye. And like many frogs, you're going to see this in a lot of species we talk about, they are variable in color. And they have sometimes a white stripe going down the back, like you can see in the bottom left image. But depending on the color morph, that stripe may or may not be present. Their call is a series of harsh quacks, a little bit duck-like, or sometimes described as a waka waka waka. And then the spring peeper is a tiny frog, so it's only about 2.5 centimeters long. The most distinctive marking is the X on the back. And like the wood frog, they have variable body color. And like many species of frogs, they have banded legs. So again, the most distinctive feature is the X. And you can find them in wooded ponds and on vegetation. And they are super loud. You can hear large choruses of them, often in various wetland habitats in the spring breeding season. And then they are very widely distributed across eastern North America. And so with that brings us to the end of our first ID session. So thank you for joining us. As always, feel free to contact us if you have any questions and follow us on social media for updates and to learn more about our programs. We hope to see you in session 3.